She stands in her kitchen at 6 in the morning, hands trembling, staring at the empty counter where her heart medication should be. 3 bottles. Gone. Without them, Nora Whitfield has 72 hours before her heart starts to fail. She calls her neighbor. He hangs up. She calls the police. They forget her name. She knocks on 4 doors. 4 doors close. At 78, Nora has become invisible. A woman the entire town has decided is not worth saving. Then 2 men in black leather vests walk into a Kingman pharmacy. Hell's Angels, patches on their backs, and they are about to do the one thing no one in this town had the decency to do. The pharmacy on Beale Street closed at 6 every evening, and every evening at 5:45, Nora Whitfield walked through its front door. She moved slowly, her left hand gripping the rubber handle of a wooden cane that had belonged to her late husband, her right hand clutching a small leather purse against her ribs as if someone might tear it away at any moment. The pharmacist, Brenda Holloway, always had Nora's prescriptions lined up and waiting on the counter before the old woman even reached it. 3 bottles, 1 for blood pressure, 1 for the irregular rhythm in her heart that made her chest flutter like a trapped bird, 1 for the arthritis that had turned her fingers into crooked branches. Kingman, Arizona was the kind of town where everyone recognized everyone, but that didn't mean everyone cared. It sat along the old Route 66 corridor, a small desert city surrounded by dry mountains and wide open sky that stretched so far it made a person feel both free and utterly alone. In summer, the heat climbed past 110 degrees and the air smelled like dust and creosote. In winter, the wind came down from the Hualapai Mountains, sharp enough to cut through a wool coat. It was a place where people waved at each other from their trucks and then went home and locked their doors, friendly on the surface, indifferent underneath. Nora had lived in the same house on Golconda Avenue for 53 years. She and her husband Richard had raised 2 sons there. Both sons had moved away decades ago, one to Portland, one to Chicago, and Richard had died 7 years back from a stroke that took him in his sleep. Since then, Nora had existed in a kind of quiet, slow-motion solitude. She tended a small garden of desert marigolds in her front yard. She watched the evening news. She walked to the pharmacy every day because it gave her a reason to leave the house. On a Tuesday, in late October, when the desert air had finally softened into something breathable, Nora came home from her walk and set her pharmacy bag on the kitchen counter the way she always did. She made herself a cup of decaffeinated tea, watched half an episode of a cooking show she didn't really follow, and went to bed at 8:30. When she woke at 6 the next morning and shuffled into the kitchen to take her pills, the bag was gone. She searched the counter. She searched the floor. She opened every cabinet, every drawer, looked behind the toaster and the bread box and the stack of coupons she kept rubber-banded together near the telephone. Nothing. She checked the bathroom, the bedroom, the living room. She retraced every step she had taken the night before. The bag was simply not there. Nora sat at the kitchen table and pressed both hands flat against its surface to stop them from shaking. Without her heart medication, she had maybe 3 days before the arrhythmia became dangerous. She had been through this before, a missed dose here and there, and her doctor had warned her clearly. Consistency was not optional. It was survival. She called her neighbor first. Craig Bellinger lived in the brick house next door, separated from Nora's property by a chain-link fence and a row of dying oleanders. Craig was 52, divorced, worked at the cement plant north of town. He answered on the 4th ring. "Craig, it's Nora from next door. I think someone came into my house last night. My medicine is gone." There was a pause. She could hear a television in the background. "You probably just misplaced it, Nora. Check the bathroom." "I've checked everywhere. The bag was on the counter and now it isn't. The back door, I think the lock might be broken. I've been meaning to fix it. Look, I'm about to head to work. I'm sure it'll turn up. Maybe try calling your sons." He hung up. Nora stared at the phone in her hand. She tried the sheriff's office next. A deputy named Watkins took the report. He was polite but clearly uninterested. Stolen medication from an unlocked house was not going to make anyone's priority list. He told her they'd look into it and suggested she call her doctor for a replacement prescription. Nora's doctor could write a new prescription, but her insurance wouldn't cover a refill for another 22 days. The out-of-pocket cost for her heart medication alone was over $400. She had $160 in her checking account. Social Security came on the 1st of the month, still 8 days away. By Thursday, Nora had knocked on 4 doors on her street. Everyone was sympathetic. No one offered to help. They nodded, they frowned, they said things like, "That's terrible," and "I hope they catch whoever did it," and then they closed their doors and went back to their lives. Nora walked home each time a little more slowly, a little more bent, as if the weight of being unseen was pressing down on her spine. On Friday afternoon, she walked to the pharmacy one more time. Not because she had money for her pills, but because Brenda Holloway was the closest thing she had to a friend. "I don't know what to do," Nora said, standing at the counter with her purse held against her chest. "Someone took my medicine, and nobody will help me." Brenda reached across the counter and placed her hand over Nora's. "Let me see what I can do about samples," she said. "I might have a few days' worth in the back." Behind Nora, the pharmacy door opened, and a gust of warm desert air pushed through the entrance. 2 men walked in. Both were large. Both wore black leather vests covered in patches. The first man had a thick brown beard streaked with grey, and arms sleeved in tattoos from wrist to shoulder. The second was younger, leaner, with a shaved head and a scar that curved along his jawline like a crescent moon. On the back of their vests, in bold white letters arched over a winged skull, it read, "Hell's Angels, Kingman." Every person in the pharmacy went still. Jack Thornton had not planned on becoming anyone's hero. He had planned on picking up a bottle of ibuprofen for a headache that had been drilling behind his left eye since dawn, and maybe a sleeve of antacids for good measure. 44 years of riding motorcycles across the American Southwest had given him a body that ran on engine grease, black coffee, and over-the-counter painkillers. He noticed the old woman immediately, not because she was doing anything remarkable, but because of the way everyone else in the pharmacy was so carefully not looking at her. She stood at the counter with her shoulders pulled inward, her voice low and strained, and even from 10 feet away Jack could hear the tremor in it. She was saying something about medicine, about someone taking it, about nobody helping. Danny Prewitt, Jack's vice president, was already moving toward the pain relief aisle, but Jack held up a hand. "Hold on," Jack said. He walked toward the counter. The woman, small, white-haired, barely 5 feet tall, flinched when she saw him approach. Her eyes darted from his tattooed hands to the patches on his vest, to the heavy silver rings on his fingers. He watched the fear register in her face, quick and instinctive, the way a rabbit freezes when it senses a hawk overhead. "Ma'am," Jack said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. He cleared his throat. "I couldn't help but overhear. Someone stole your medication?" Nora Whitfield looked up at him. Her eyes were pale blue, almost translucent, like desert sky reflected in still water. She was 78 years old and weighed maybe 105 pounds, and she was looking at him the way the entire town of Kingman looked at him, like he was something to survive. "Yes," she said carefully, "from my kitchen, 3 days ago." "Did you call the police?" "I called the sheriff's office. They took a report. A deputy said he'd look into it." Jack glanced at Danny, who had come to stand beside him. Danny's expression was neutral, but Jack knew him well enough to read the tightness around his jaw. They'd both grown up in homes where the adults couldn't afford their pills. Danny's mother had rationed her insulin for 2 years before she died. "And nobody's done anything," Jack said. "It wasn't a question." "No," Nora said. "Nobody." Brenda Holloway stood behind the counter watching this exchange with wide eyes. She had worked in Kingman for 11 years and had never seen a Hells Angels member have a conversation with an elderly woman that didn't involve the elderly woman crossing the street to avoid him. "What kind of medication?" Jack asked. Nora told him. Metoprolol for the arrhythmia, lisinopril for blood pressure, meloxicam for the arthritis. Jack didn't know what any of those words meant, but he understood the part about not being able to afford replacements for 22 days. "Where do you live?" he asked. "Golconda Avenue, the yellow house with the marigolds." Jack nodded. He pulled a worn leather wallet from his back pocket and set $500 bills on the counter. The pharmacy went completely silent. A woman near the greeting card section actually stepped backward. "Brenda," Jack said, reading the pharmacist's name tag. "Can you fill her prescriptions today?" Brenda blinked. Yes, I can do that." "Good." Jack turned back to Nora. "You'll get your medicine today, and we're going to find out who took it." Nora's mouth opened slightly. She looked from the money on the counter to Jack's face, to Danny standing behind him. Tears gathered in the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them back with the practiced discipline of a woman who had spent 7 years crying alone. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you help me?" Jack didn't smile. His face wasn't built for smiling. But something shifted behind his dark brown eyes. Something old, something that remembered a grandmother in Flagstaff who used to cut her blood pressure pills in half because the pharmacy was too far and the money was never enough. "Because somebody should have already," he said. That evening, Jack sat at the long wooden table in the clubhouse on Industrial Boulevard and laid out what he knew. 6 members of the Kingman chapter listened. The room was dim and cluttered with decades of accumulated life, motorcycle parts stacked against the walls, a pool table with a torn felt surface shoved into one corner, a row of lockers with padlocks that no one ever opened. The air smelled like motor oil and stale beer, and the faint sweetness of the cigars that old members used to smoke before time caught up with them. An American flag hung on the wall beside a map of Arizona, marked with riding routes and faded photographs of members who were no longer around. Some dead, some in prison, some simply vanished into the vast indifference of the American highway system. "Her name's Nora Whitfield," Jack said. 78, lives alone. Somebody broke into her kitchen through a busted back door and took her heart medication. She told the cops, told her neighbors, told anyone who'd listen. Nobody did a thing. Mike Shelton, the youngest member at 29, leaned forward. "Who steals an old lady's heart pills?" "Somebody who knows what metoprolol goes for on the street," Danny said. "Or somebody who doesn't care what they grab as long as they can sell it." Jack tapped the table with his index finger. "I want to know who did this. Not to make a point. Not for publicity. Because an old woman is going to die without those pills, and the people in this town who are supposed to care are too busy pretending she doesn't exist." The room was quiet. Then, one by one, every man at the table nodded. The next morning, Jack rode to Golconda Avenue. He brought Danny and Mike with him. 3 Harley-Davidsons rumbled down the residential street at 8 in the morning, and curtains moved in every window on the block. Nora was in her front yard, watering the marigolds with a dented tin can. She watched the 3 motorcycles park along her curb, and this time she didn't flinch. She straightened her spine, set down the watering can, and walked toward them. "Good morning," she said. "Morning, Mrs. Whitfield," Jack said, removing his sunglasses. "Mind if we take a look at that back door?" The back door was worse than Jack expected. The lock wasn't just broken, it had been pried open with something flat, a screwdriver or a crowbar, leaving deep gouges in the wooden frame. The deadbolt was a cheap hardware store model, the kind that could be defeated with a firm shoulder. Someone had entered this house with minimal effort and no fear of consequences. Mike knelt by the door and examined the marks. "This wasn't random," he said. "Whoever did this knew the door was weak, knew which side to hit. Which means they've been here before, Danny added, or they've been watching. Nora stood in the kitchen doorway, watching them work. Her house was immaculate, everything clean, everything in its place. But Jack could see the signs of age in every detail. The cracked linoleum floor, the yellow wallpaper peeling at the seams, the refrigerator that hummed too loudly, working too hard. This was a home that had been loved for decades, but could no longer be maintained by the woman who lived in it. "Mrs. Whitfield," Jack said, "has anyone been to your house recently? A repairman, a delivery person, anyone you don't usually see?" Nora thought carefully. "There was a young man," she said, "about 2 weeks ago. He came to the door and said he was with the city. Something about checking water meters. He asked to come inside to look at the pipes under the kitchen sink." Danny and Jack exchanged a look. "Did you let him in?" Jack asked. "I did. He seemed polite. He had a clipboard. He was in the kitchen for maybe 10 minutes. Then he thanked me and left." "Can you describe him?" "Tall, thin, sandy-colored hair. He had a tattoo on his neck. I remember because I thought it looked like a spider web." Mike pulled out his phone. Within 2 hours, they had a name. Kingman was small enough that a tall, thin man with a spiderweb neck tattoo wasn't hard to identify. A few phone calls to the right people, a bartender at the Silver Spur, a mechanic who ran a side business in motorcycle parts, a gas station attendant on Stockton Hill Road who knew every face that passed through town, and the pieces fell together. His name was Tyler Dunn, 23 years old. He lived in a trailer park on the east side of town and had 2 prior arrests for petty theft. He was not employed by the city, had never been employed by the city, and had no connection to the water department. Jack felt something tighten in his chest. Not anger, exactly, but something harder. Contempt, maybe, for a man who would dress up in a costume and walk into an old woman's house and map out what he could steal. There was a particular cruelty in that. It wasn't just theft. It was the deliberate targeting of someone who couldn't fight back, someone whose vulnerability was visible from the street. That afternoon, Sheriff Tom Archer received a phone call from Jack Thornton. It was the first time the 2 men had ever spoken directly. Their relationship, such as it was, had always been conducted through intermediaries, through deputies who pulled bikers over for noise violations, through lawyers who filed complaints about targeted policing. "Sheriff," Jack said, "I want to report a burglary suspect. Tyler Dunn, 23, lives on the east side. He posed as a city worker to gain access to an elderly woman's home on Golconda Avenue and stole her medication. Her name is Nora Whitfield. I believe your office already has the original report." There was a long silence. Jack could almost hear the sheriff recalculating. "How exactly did you come by this information, Thornton?" "We talked to the victim. We talked to people in the neighborhood. We did the work your deputies should have done 3 days ago." Another silence. Then, "I'll look into it." "You'll do more than look into it," Jack said, and his voice dropped to the low register that made most people reconsider their next sentence. "That woman has a heart condition. She could have died. If Dunn is still walking free by tomorrow, I'll handle it my way, and you won't like my way." Jack hung up. He sat in the parking lot of the clubhouse and stared at the Hualapai Mountains turning purple against the sunset. He thought about the way the people at the pharmacy had looked at him when he'd put the money on the counter. Not with gratitude, with suspicion, as if kindness from a man in a leather vest was automatically a transaction, a debt that would come due in ugly ways. He was used to it. He had been used to it for 20 years. Every interaction in this town was filtered through the same lens, the vest, the patches, the reputation that preceded him like a weather front. People decided who he was before he opened his mouth. They decided what his kindness meant before he could explain that it meant nothing more than kindness. The suspicion was exhausting, and on his worst days it made him wonder whether the wall between him and the rest of Kingman would ever come down, or whether he had simply built his life on the wrong side of it. His phone rang. It was Danny. Craig Bellinger, Nora's neighbor. I talked to his co-worker at the cement plant. Turns out Craig saw someone at Nora's back door the night the meds were stolen. Saw someone walking through the yard with a flashlight. He watched from his bedroom window, and he didn't call anyone. He said he figured it was none of his business. Jack closed his eyes. None of his business. A 78-year-old woman living alone, and her neighbor watches someone break into her house and decides it's not his problem. But a Hells Angels member buys her medication, and suddenly the whole town has opinions about motive. "We're going back to Golconda in the morning," Jack said. "I want to fix that door." "Jack, we're not contractors." "No, but we're the only ones who showed up." That night, Nora Whitfield took her medication for the first time in 4 days. She stood in her kitchen, swallowed each pill with a glass of water from the tap, and looked at the $500 worth of medicine lined up on her counter. Then she sat down and cried, not because she was sad, because for the first time in years, someone had looked at her and actually seen her. The arrest of Tyler Dunn happened on a Wednesday morning, 6 days after Nora's medication was stolen. Sheriff Archer sent 2 deputies to the trailer park on the east side. They found Dunn asleep on a couch, surrounded by empty beer cans and a shoebox containing 14 bottles of prescription medication stolen from 3 different homes in the Golconda neighborhood over the past 2 months. Nora had not been his only victim. She had simply been the only one who spoke up. The news spread through Kingman, the way all news spread in small towns, quickly, imprecisely, and with liberal embellishment. By noon, the story had passed through the hardware store, the diner on Andy Devine Avenue, the post office, and the waiting room of every doctor's office in town. The Hells Angels had caught a thief. The Hells Angels had helped an old woman. The Hells Angels had done what the sheriff's office hadn't. This last part bothered Tom Archer considerably. He drove to the clubhouse on Industrial Boulevard that afternoon, parking his cruiser in the gravel lot between a row of Harleys and a pickup truck with a trailer hitch. Jack was inside, sitting at the bar, reading a motorcycle parts catalog. He looked up when the sheriff walked in, but didn't stand. "Dunn's in custody," Archer said. "Charges are being filed. Burglary, theft, criminal impersonation." "Good," Jack said. "I want to be clear about something, Thornton. This is my jurisdiction. I don't need a motorcycle club doing my job." Jack set the catalog down. He looked at the sheriff with the steady, unblinking gaze that made most people uncomfortable. "You didn't do your job, Sheriff. That's the point. Nora Whitfield called your office 6 days ago. A deputy took a report and filed it in whatever drawer reports go to die. Nobody followed up. Nobody knocked on a single door. An old woman with a heart condition was 4 days without medication because your department decided her stolen pills weren't worth the paperwork." Archer's jaw tightened. "We have limited resources. We can't investigate every missing pill bottle." "It wasn't a missing pill bottle. It was a burglary. She told your deputy her door was forced open. That's a felony, not a misdemeanor. You treated it like a lost earring." The sheriff stood there for a moment, his hat in his hands. He was a man who had been in law enforcement for 30 years, and he was standing in a biker clubhouse being lectured about due diligence by a man whose organization was classified by federal agencies as a criminal enterprise. The irony was not lost on him. The accuracy of the criticism was worse. "I'll make sure Mrs. Whitfield's case gets proper attention going forward," Archer said stiffly. "That's all I'm asking," Jack said. But the town's reaction was more complicated than the sheriff's grudging acknowledgement. The story had created a kind of cognitive dissonance that Kingman didn't know how to process. People who had spent years crossing the street to avoid Jack Thornton and his crew were now forced to reconcile that avoidance with the fact that those same men had done something genuinely decent. Something better than decent. Something that made every neighbor, every deputy, every well-meaning citizen who had told Nora, "I hope they catch whoever did it," look exactly like what they were. People who had chosen comfort over compassion. Craig Bellinger felt it worst of all. The day after Dunn's arrest, he came home from work and found a new deadbolt installed on Nora's back door. The wood frame had been reinforced with a steel plate. A motion sensor light had been mounted above the door, and new locks had been fitted on every window. 3 motorcycles had been parked in front of Nora's house that morning, and Craig had watched from his kitchen window as the bikers worked for 4 hours in the October sun, fixing what he could have fixed in a weekend months ago if he had ever bothered to ask. He stood in his own backyard, looking at the new hardware on Nora's door through the chain-link fence, and felt something settle in his stomach like a stone. He had watched someone break into her house. He had watched and done nothing, not because he didn't care, but because caring required effort, and effort was inconvenient, and inconvenience was something Craig Bellinger had organized his entire life to avoid. That evening he knocked on Nora's front door. She opened it slowly, the chain still on. "Craig," she said. "Nora, I—" He stopped, started again. "I saw someone in your yard that night. I should have called. I should have come over. I should have done a lot of things. I'm sorry." Nora looked at him for a long time. She was a woman who had survived a Great Depression childhood, raised 2 sons, buried a husband, and outlived most of her friends. She had earned the right to hold grudges. But she had also lived long enough to know that grudges were just another kind of weight, and she was already carrying more than she could bear. "Come in, Craig," she said. "I just made coffee." Meanwhile, something unexpected was happening at the clubhouse. People were calling, not the police, not journalists, ordinary people. A woman named Patricia Kendrick from the south side of town called to say her elderly father's yard was overgrown, and she lived 3 hours away and couldn't maintain it. A man named Donald Webb called to report that his disabled wife's wheelchair ramp had collapsed, and the city had put them on a 6-month waiting list. A single mother named Angela Foster called because her landlord hadn't fixed her heater in 2 months, and winter was coming. Jack listened to each call with the same expression. Patient, serious, slightly bewildered. He had spent 20 years being treated as a threat. He did not know how to be treated as a solution. "We're not a charity," Danny said after the 5th call. "No," Jack said, "we're not." "So, what are we doing?" Jack looked around the clubhouse, at the flag on the wall, at the men who trusted him, at the phone that kept ringing. "We're being what they never expected us to be," he said. "And that's enough to scare them more than the leather ever did." November came to Kingman with cold mornings and skies so clear they looked painted. The mountains turned from purple to grey, and the desert scrub went golden brown along the roadsides. Nora Whitfield's marigolds finally surrendered to the season, their petals curling inward like small fists, but she left the stalks standing because she liked the way they looked against the yellow paint of her house. Jack came by every Saturday. He never announced these visits and never stayed long. He would ride down Golconda Avenue alone, park his Harley at the curb, and sit on Nora's porch for 20 minutes while she told him about her week. He learned that her husband Richard had been a mechanic too, that her oldest son David called every Sunday from Portland but hadn't visited in 3 years, that her younger son Brian had stopped calling altogether after a falling out over money that Nora refused to explain. She asked about his life with the same direct, unembroidered curiosity. Jack told her things he hadn't told most of the men in his own club, that he had dropped out of high school at 16, that his father had been a long-haul trucker who was gone 11 months of the year and mean as a rattlesnake the 12th, that he had joined the Hells Angels at 24, not because he wanted to be an outlaw, but because they were the first group of people who had ever made him feel like he belonged somewhere. "People think the club is about breaking laws," Jack said one Saturday, holding a cup of the terrible instant coffee Nora insisted on making. "Some of it is, I won't pretend otherwise, but most of it is about having a family that shows up, every time, no exceptions." "That's all anyone wants," Nora said. "Yeah," Jack said, "that's all anyone wants." The Tyler Dunn case went to trial in December. Dunn pleaded guilty to 3 counts of burglary and 1 count of criminal impersonation. He was sentenced to 4 years in state prison. Nora attended the sentencing. She sat in the back row of the courtroom in a navy blue dress she had pressed that morning, her cane hooked over the back of the pew in front of her. She did not speak during the proceedings. She did not need to. Her presence was its own statement. Jack did not attend. He had made a deliberate choice to stay away from the courthouse, to let the legal system do its work without the visual complication of a Hells Angels president sitting in the gallery. But he waited in the parking lot, leaning against his motorcycle, and when Nora emerged into the December sunlight, he was the first person she saw. "It's done," she said. "How do you feel?" She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I feel seen," she said. "For the first time in a long time, I feel like I exist." Jack nodded. He understood that feeling better than she knew. Being seen, truly seen, was a currency more valuable than anything in his wallet. The world had looked at Nora and seen a burden. It had looked at Jack and seen a danger. Both assessments were shortcuts, lazy conclusions drawn by people too busy or too frightened to look closer. The Kingman chapter didn't become a charity. Jack was clear about that with his men, with the community and with himself, but something had shifted, something that couldn't be unshifted. The phone calls continued, fewer each week, but steady. Some the club could help with, some they couldn't. Danny organized a Saturday where 6 members spent the morning building a wheelchair ramp for Donald Webb's wife. Mike Shelton, who turned out to have an unexpected talent for yard work, spent 2 weekends clearing Patricia Kendrick's father's property. They didn't do these things for publicity or for image management. They did them because Nora Whitfield had shown them something they had forgotten, that being strong wasn't just about what you could endure. It was about what you chose to carry for someone else. The town adjusted slowly, the way small towns do. Sheriff Archer implemented a new protocol for reports involving elderly or vulnerable residents, a direct response, everyone knew, to the embarrassment of the Whitfield case. Craig Bellinger started checking on Nora every evening, a brief knock on the door, a wave through the window, small gestures that cost him nothing but meant everything to the woman on the other side. Brenda Holloway set up a program at the pharmacy where customers could donate toward medication costs for uninsured seniors. She called it the Nora Fund. Nora cried when she heard about it. Then she baked Brenda a pie and delivered it herself. On a Saturday in late January, Jack sat on Nora's porch in the winter sunshine. The air was cold, but the light was warm, and the mountains stood sharp and clear against a sky that looked like it went on forever. Nora brought out 2 cups of terrible instant coffee and lowered herself carefully into the chair beside him. "Jack," she said, "can I tell you something?" "Yes, Mom." When you first walked into that pharmacy, I was afraid of you. I looked at you, and I saw everything the television and the newspapers told me I should see. A dangerous man, a criminal, someone to avoid. Most people do. Most people are wrong. She took a sip of her coffee. "You are the kindest man I have met in this town in 7 years, and I have lived here for 53. Jack stared at the mountains. He didn't trust himself to speak for a moment. When he did, his voice was quieter than usual. "My grandmother," he said. "She lived alone in Flagstaff. Same situation as you. Heart problems. Couldn't afford all her pills. Neighbors who didn't bother. I was 19 when she died. I was too young and too stupid to help her. And by the time I figured out what I should have done, it was too late." He paused. "When I heard you in that pharmacy, I heard her. And I decided that this time it wouldn't be too late." Nora reached over and placed her small, crooked hand on top of his large, tattooed one. They sat like that for a while, an unlikely pair on a porch in the Arizona sun. An old woman the world had forgotten, and a man the world had feared, proving in their quiet way that the distance between those two things was much shorter than anyone wanted to admit. The motorcycles still rumbled down Golconda Avenue on Saturday mornings. The neighbors still watched from behind their curtains. But now, when the engines cut off and the big man with the beard walked up to the yellow house with the dead marigolds, a few of them smiled. Not all of them, but enough. And Nora Whitfield, who had spent 7 years being invisible, stood on her porch every Saturday and waved, not just to Jack, to all of them, to the whole street, as if to say, "I am here. I have always been here. You just had to look."